By 1916, the Great War had become a spectacular failure of imagination. Over at Verdun, the French and Germans were engaged in a contest to see who could most efficiently turn human beings into fertilizer. The French, running low on fertilizer, asked their British allies for a favor, a distraction, if you will. The British High Command, led by General Sir Douglas Haig, a man whose mustache was more flexible than his tactics, came up with a plan. It was a truly stunning piece of work, the kind of plan you get when you believe wars are won on a sufficiently large piece of paper. They called it the Big Push. The idea was to bombard the German lines on the river Somme with so much artillery for an entire week that nothing could possibly survive. Not a mouse, not a blade of grass, and certainly not a single German. Afterwards, the British troops would simply stroll across no man's land, have a bit of a tidy-up, and be home in time for tea. It was simple, elegant, and had absolutely no connection to reality whatsoever. The preliminary bombardment began on June 24th. For 7 solid days, 1,500 British guns fired over 1.7 million shells at the German positions. The sound was so colossal, so earth-shattering, that it was reportedly heard in London, 140 miles away. People thought it was thunder. From the British perspective, this was a fantastic success. They were making a very big noise. Unfortunately, what they weren't doing was effectively destroying the German defenses. The Germans, you see, had spent 2 years digging in. They hadn't just scooped out shallow ditches. They'd engineered deep, concrete-reinforced bunkers, some 30 feet underground, called Stollen. While the British were busy rearranging the mud on the surface, the German soldiers were deep below, playing cards, drinking beer, and patiently waiting for the noise to stop. To make matters worse, nearly a third of the British shells were duds, thanks to rushed wartime production. The bombardment wasn't an annihilator. It was a giant, week-long alarm clock announcing a 9 a.m. appointment with death. At 7:30 a.m. on July 1st, 1916, whistles blew all along the British line. The moment had arrived. Convinced the Germans had been positively annihilated, officers ordered their men to advance. Not to run or take cover, but to walk. They were to walk in neat, orderly lines spaced out as if on a parade ground. Each man was also burdened with about 66 pounds of equipment, enough gear to start a small hardware store. The logic, if you can call it that, was that the advance had to be steady to not lose cohesion. Speed was unnecessary because the enemy was vaporized. As the British troops emerged into the morning mist, the German soldiers climbed out of their cozy bunkers, set up their Maxim machine guns, and were greeted with the single greatest target of their lives. The next few hours were not a battle, they were an industrial process. By the end of the day, the British Army had suffered 57,470 casualties, including 19,240 killed. It remains the single most catastrophic day in its entire history. The plan had a slight flaw. To truly appreciate the scale of this mismanagement, we have to look at the Royal Newfoundland Regiment. They weren't even a part of Britain yet. They were a dominion. At a place called Beaumont Hamel, their attack was delayed. When they finally went over the top, they had to cross hundreds of yards of open ground in full daylight, directly into the teeth of uncut barbed wire and waiting German guns. A Hawthorne Ridge mine had been detonated nearby 10 minutes early, basically serving as a personal invitation for every German machine gunner to get ready. The Newfoundlanders advanced into a storm of bullets. Of the roughly 800 men who went forward, only 68 were able to answer roll call the next morning, a 90% casualty rate in about 30 minutes. The danger tree, a skeletal landmark halfway across their advance, became a haunting symbol of the point of no return. They didn't just fail to take their objective, An entire generation of a small country's men was effectively erased from existence before breakfast. Faced with this unprecedented disaster, you might think a strategic rethink was in order. Perhaps a pause, a moment of quiet contemplation. General Haig, however, was not a man for quiet contemplation. His response to the catastrophic failure of his plan was to continue the plan for another 5 months. His diary entry for the day noted, "Casualties were as expected." The Somme devolved from a single, glorious push into a grinding, soul-destroying battle of attrition. It was a slugging match in a sea of mud, where thousands of lives were exchanged for a few hundred yards of cratered wasteland. Amidst the horror, there was one clumsy glimmer of the future: the tank. These new land ships made their debut in September. They were terrifying, mechanically unreliable, and prone to getting stuck in the mud. Used in tiny numbers, they were a curiosity, not a game changer. It was like trying to put out a forest fire with a squirt gun, but a really interesting, futuristic squirt gun. The battle dragged on into the autumn. Constant shelling and relentless rain transformed the entire landscape into a primordial swamp. The mud of the Somme became a weapon in itself. It was a thick, clinging morass mixed with shell fragments, unexploded ordnance, and the remains of the dead. Men and horses drowned in it. Getting supplies to the front became a Herculean task. Wounded men left in shell holes could sink without a trace. This wasn't war. It was a struggle against a malevolent planet. And for what? After nearly 5 months of this industrial-scale hellscape, the furthest Allied advance was about 6 miles. Let's do some quick, horrifying math. With over 1 million total casualties on all sides, that's roughly 1 casualty for every inch of ground gained. An entire human life, a son, a husband, a father, exchanged for the length of your thumb on a map. The sheer economic inefficiency is staggering, even before you consider the human cost. The offensive eventually just fizzled out in November, more because of the winter weather than any strategic conclusion. The final butcher's bill was over 1.1 million casualties combined: British, Commonwealth, French, and German. The Somme didn't win the war. It didn't break the German army, though it certainly bled it white, but it also bled the British and French armies white. Haig's defenders, then and now, argue that it was a necessary evil. It relieved the pressure on the French at Verdun and taught the British army hard lessons in modern warfare. This is the "you have to break a few million eggs to make an omelet" school of thought. But the Somme became a scar on the British psyche. It represented the ultimate clash between Old World generals and New World technology, where the bill was paid entirely in the flesh of ordinary men. It stands as a timeless, brutal monument to the idea that if a plan is failing spectacularly, the absolute worst thing you can do is stick to it with grim determination. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds.